Hello to all of you who are gathered this morning. We certainly thank God for your presence with us for this news briefing. I'm Bishop William J. Barber II, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, along with the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris. Let me say right off the bat, it is the commitment of the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, to go full all out in this moment of our national moral sickness. When we see political and physical insurrection, when we see assaults on the poor, when we see widespread assaults on voting rights and democracy, when we see misinformation campaigns and billions being spent to divide us, in this moment, we are committed to mobilizing the largest mass assembly of poor people and low-wage workers in this nation's history. The Mass Poor Peoples and Low-Wage Workers Assembly Moral March on Washington and to the polls, June 18th, 2022. COVID and the policy response to it has exposed even more the glaring realities of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, underfunding of public education, denial of healthcare, overfunding of the war economy, and the false and distorted moral religious narrative of religious nationalism, coupled with the notions of white supremacy that impact the 140 million poor and low wealth people in this nation. We are in a crisis of civilization. We are in a crisis of democracy. We are in a crisis of morality that we must seek redemption from. We must believe we have in God and in the great principles of love and truth and justice and nonviolence, the spiritual and moral power to turn this nation in new directions toward a more just society. There must be a third Reconstruction in America. We must, in the nonviolent moral tradition, put a face on the pain that obstructionism and trickle-down economics and neoliberalism and voter suppression is and has caused. We must shift the moral narrative, build power, and place before the nation an agenda and a way forward that refuses to accept the lies of scarcity and the constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, politically insensitive, and economically insane politics that we are witnessing today. Poor and low wealth people who represent 30% of the electorate and 45% of the electorate in battleground states have decided with religious leaders and other activists in labor to intensify and embolden their outcry, outreach, and organizing and voting. The Mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls is not just a day of action. It is a declaration that we won't be silent anymore. It is the declaration of an ongoing, committed, nonviolent, truth-telling, multiracial, interfaith moral movement. We will shift the moral narrative. We will build and mobilize political voting power. We will utilize, where necessary, nonviolent civil disobedience. We will make real policies to fully address poverty and low wealth from the bottom up and protect and expand voting rights and the fundamental infrastructure of our democracy. America must address simultaneously, not separately, systemic racism, systemic poverty, denial of healthcare, ecological devastation, the war economy, and this distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism and white supremacy. And it must be done with a continuous, long-term, in the streets, in the suites, in the voting booths, in the pulpits movement agenda that brings together poor and low wealth people, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, people from every race, creed, color, region, sexuality, our 45 coordinating committees in 45 states religious leaders. We're working with over 200 partner organizations, economists, and voting rights advocates who are united by a moral fusion agenda and a long-term nonviolent moral activism and analysis informed by our deepest constitutional and religious values. We won't be silent anymore. Someone's been hurting our people too long, and we are not in this for a moment, but for a movement. And June 18th, everything that leads up to it and after it will be for the fundamental shifting of the narrative and changing the sickness that we're seeing in our nation. And we are here to stay. Our deadline is victory. Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris.
Thank you so much, Bishop Barber. It's an honor to be with everybody here today. We must launch the mass Poor People's and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls. Because as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said when he was calling for a Poor People's campaign, there is a fire raging for the poor of this society. They are living in tragic conditions because of the terrible economic injustices that keep them locked in. Disinherited people all over the world are bleeding to death from deep social and economic wounds. They need brigades of ambulance drivers who will have to ignore the red lights of the present system until the emergency is solved. As we all know, tomorrow would have been Reverend Dr. King's 92nd birthday, but his words speak to our reality still today. In a nation that has lost more than 840,000 Americans to the coronavirus, we hear ambulances driving through red lights even 2 years into this pandemic. There are fires and storms raging across the entire nation because of the climate crisis. Poor people, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native, Indigenous, are dying from deep social and economic wounds brought on by policy violence. Before the pandemic, there were already 140 million poor and low-income people. Now millions more have joined those locked in by economic injustice. So we're organizing a mass Poor People and Low-Wage Workers Assembly, a moral march on Washington and to the polls, because our democracy is on its deathbed. People are dying from poverty and inequality. The earth is on fire, so we're signing up ambulance drivers. We're running through the red lights of closed polling places and redistricting and all forms of voter suppression. We're running through the red lights of poverty and homelessness and low wages and unemployment and abandonment in the midst of abundance. We have and can solve the climate crisis, the crisis of war and a war economy, the crisis of religious, especially Christian nationalism. Because we as a people, from the hood to the holler, from the Bronx to the border, from the California coast to the Carolinas, are being ambulance drivers, readying ourselves to save the heart and soul of this democracy and moving forward together, not one step back. See you on June 18th and from there.
Thank you so much, Liz. And we'll be talking about the tools we're going to be doing and the actions that'll be coming between now and June 18th and even beyond. For, as Dr. King said on that last speech with us, nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back at this point. Now, we always start with impacted people whenever there's a Poor People's Campaign press conference, because it is important that media, you hear from the real moral voices in this country, the people who are impacted by the policies, who have the power, and as we said earlier, who represent in battleground state 45% of the electorate now in this country and over 140 million. First, I'm going to ask our tech person to just show you some slides real quickly. Going through will be slides, and they will just show you some slides that have some facts on them. We have them listed. This one lists the whole number of 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country. Just that number itself is shameful and it says something about what we need to do. Turn to the next one. This slide shows, and we will put it in the chat, the numbers, the totals in every state. Look at those, 20 million in California, in Texas, 12 million. Look, those are numbers that we don't hear in the media, and we should. And this is why we cannot bifurcate issues. And every state had that, and Minnesota, look at over 1 million. 43% of adults, 52% of children are poor and low income in this country. That is a moral tragedy. Any other slide? Look at the power of low income voters. Look at it across this state. We hear so much about what's going to happen in voting, but the reality is our study that was done called The Waking the Sleeping Giant says if poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, and color and others would come together, and just between 1% and 20% of those already registered who haven't voted would vote, it could fundamentally shift electoral outcomes in this country. Oh yes, we intend to mobilize. Now there's a video of testifiers who we want you to hear from, and then you will hear some live voices.
No, we're not going to consider policies for the poor, the underprivileged, the underprivileged, the suffering, our vets. No, we're not going to think about them before we make a policy decision.
During this pandemic, I worked as a server with Waffle House, making only $3.10 an hour plus tips. But like so many essential workers, I never had sick days. I never had any hazard pay. I never had any health care.
Venus was my daughter. Having no primary care doctor and no medical insurance, Venus had to wait to be approved for every medical procedure she received. Then lapsed into a coma, and she finally got the CAT scan that she needed, and they found 2 tumors in her brain. One had ruptured. The next day, we gathered around Venus to say our goodbyes, and we unplugged the tube, and Venus died. No parent should have, in America, should have to bury their child for lack of medicated space.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
I see poverty in my own community. You know, there's a 70% unemployment rate in the reservation right now.
I'm a Vietnam veteran. I was raised poor. My only chance of going to college was joining the Army. We are demanding that we stop spending money on the war economy. We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
I'm the one of the many faces representing homelessness and poverty here in New York State. There are many others like me that sleeping in shelters every night, thousands like us that can't afford to find low-income housing. We live in one of the richest countries in the world, and yet people are homeless. That's ridiculous. 51% of New Yorkers are poor or low income. People are not poor because they're lazy and they don't want to work. People are poor because our government is depriving us of living wages, health care, and public assistance. That ain't right.
It's really sad to see what's not been going on, but it's also really, really sad about the loss of 11 people in my family. It's really sad. And the thing that makes it even more angry, the fact to see that people aren't walking around with masks and they're not social distancing in the way that they should. But at the same time, you can't be mad at them in per se, because, you know, they have to work. There's no way else that they can do anything. So I think that we should have something done so people can be able to stay in their houses, so then other people won't have to die and they won't have to see their family members have their last breath drawn.
I'm from Texas. My children's lives and those that are Texas residents are at stake. We have elected officials that are fighting to suppress my vote, but are doing nothing for those of us who lost loved ones in our snowstorm.
My God, my God.
We have those who are trying to prevent us from having $15 a minimum wage, but are encouraging us to pay the energy companies that didn't provide energy.
Jesus.
during the snowstorm.
Yes, sir. That's it. That's it.
I have been forced with many challenges in my life due to a broken system in the state of Mississippi that has a long history of punishing the poor while rewarding the corrupt, elite, wealthy class. The broken system in Mississippi has exploited me as an individual with low wages, my voting rights, being disenfranchised voter, and as a sex trafficking survivor. The broken system that I speak of is responsible for a lot of my brokenness even into the adult years, but it's not just in Mississippi, it's all over this country.
That's right.
I'm here to tell Congress we can no longer rely on states such as Mississippi that just abolished slavery in 2013 to do the right thing.
I'm a fourth generation family farmer. The market pressures impacting farmers and their operations are affecting not just the health of our farm economy, but also the health of those who live in rural communities. Suicides have increased amongst farmers.
There's a new chemical company that's producing another carcinogen. In our community, it's amazing the people who just started dying of cancer. And when my wife was diagnosed with cancer, I was amazed at the black women that would ring our doorbell and walk in the door and pull a wig off to show my wife that I have it too.
So I am a first generation student, a food service worker, and a queer person who was born and raised in Knox County, Kentucky. I've at times balanced living in my car, working through jobs to pay for school and save for an apartment, and then doing the same balancing act to pay for various car repairs and rent once I found a place. I was used to watching my mom walk into the grocery store, or waiting to walk into the grocery store until it was cleared out so that people wouldn't notice we had SNAP. I grew up in a conservative and majority white town, consumed with that Christian nationalist outlook.
As an undocumented person, I just want to reiterate that the national emergency that is being put out there, it's not at the border. It's here, at our doorsteps. It's here when we have children that don't have quality air to breathe. It's here when we have parents like myself struggling to pay rent. It's here, and we need to make sure that people know that these 140 million people that are living in poverty today in the United States are rising up and saying no more.
I want to be able to say that this campaign and you alongside with us were able to change the direction that this nation is going towards. And I want to be able to look at my daughter in the face and say, we did this because of you, and we've continued to change because our children need this change. Thank you.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Members of the media, we wanted you to hear voices of persons who, every one of those that you heard were at events, organizing and planning and preparing for this mass poor people's low wage workers assembly and march on Washington and to the polls. And some of them couldn't be, but they wanted you to hear them. Now we have, and you have the agenda, you should have it. We're going to have 5 live voices who each going to give 1-minute statements of support and why, who are poor and low income and impacted. Then we will hear from 2 economists. One is Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, renowned economist. And then we will hear from some partners, persons who are partnering with us, some who lead major organizations and constituencies, some who lead major denominations who are just representative of the many, many others that are joining with us. And then we'll be ready almost then to take questions from the media. So at this time, we have coming in this order, Pam Garrison from West Virginia Poor People's Campaign, Callie Greer from Alabama Poor People's Campaign, Danita Jones from Texas Poor People's Campaign, Emily Johnson from the Mississippi Poor People's Campaign, Leon Tyler from the Pennsylvania Poor People's Campaign, and Robin Brown from the Ohio Poor People's Campaign. Each of them are going to say in their own words why they are mobilizing.
We're going to bring the country roads to D.C. We know these interlocking justices is caused by a failed system that has prioritized corporations and the filthy rich over the people, over us. We're their expendable commodity, is what we are. It doesn't have to be this way. Nothing would be more tragic than to turn around now. Join us on June 18th, 2022. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. The country rose. Callie?
I'm helping to mobilize folks to DC on June 18th for the Moral March in DC to remind those that have elected us to work that we've elected to work for the betterment of all our lives. Though we've been limited in visual presence because of this pandemic, we've not decreased in numbers, but we've actually grown as truths are being revealed about poor people. And that truth is the poor people are actually the heartbeat of this world, and that y'all have been mistreating this bipartisan society for a long time. And now these injustices are being laying bare for all to see again. We demand that we be given what others have always enjoyed: a living wage, health care for every human being, decent housing, equal voting rights, the end of mass incarceration of low wealth and poor people, and the list goes on. I'm sure my colleagues will fill in the blank. Are we asking for too much? Of course not. And nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn around now. So on June 18, 2020, we're coming to DC to say this in every way possible and non-violently, that we demand to be treated as the elected officials are being treated without even asking. Forward together, not one step back.
Amen, Callie. We're not demanding too much. We are actually trying to help this nation save itself. Danita.
Thank you, Reverend Barber. I speak to you today from Dallas, Texas, asking Congress and our state leaders, do you hear that? Do you hear that? That's the sound of your constituents. Hear us as we are rising up against your oppressive policies. Hear us as we march for democracy. Hear us as we speak the true narrative of the 140 million. You have destroyed this nation's land, sea, air, and water, and now you are turned your sights on the people. For what? To enrich corporations? Corporations where one company earned $13 billion and another $213 million during the snowstorm here in Texas at the expense of the people. Gone are the days that you tell us there is not enough. Gone are the days where you try to divide us. Those days are gone. Hear me and hear us well. The moral resurrection is upon you, and it's time to decide now, which side are you on? June 18th, 2022 in Washington, D.C., that is your deadline. Decide now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danita. And you remind us too many have died. 250,000 poor and low-wealth people are dying every year from poverty, 700 a day. We can't take that and stand for that anymore. And so we're coming. Emily Johnson from Mississippi.
Good morning. I'm mobilizing and organizing Mississippians to join us in D.C. on June 18th for the Mass Poor People and Low Wage Workers Assembly in March on Washington. I'm with the Poor People's Campaign, and I want to emphasize that exploitation does not have a color or a party. I'm here as a survivor of sex trafficking, formerly incarcerated, and living in long-term recovery from drug addiction, and I'm a low-wage worker. I had to live in a homeless shelter for over a year due to not being able to afford housing after incarceration. I was denied SNAP benefits because I had a job working 40 hours a week making minimum wage. I've been denied employment and housing because of my background on numerous occasions. After release from jail, I was basically told to go be productive with absolutely no resources. I did work every single day since the beginning of the pandemic. I've risked my life and my family's life trying to make ends meet, just trying to earn a living. I am a single mother of 4, and I've been working 2 jobs for the last few years, 7 days a week. I am tired.
That's right.
I have been faced with many challenges in my life due to a broken system in the state of Mississippi that has a long history of punishing the poor while rewarding the corrupt, wealthy class. I stand with the Poor People's Campaign because we are in desperate need of this third Reconstruction.
Thank you so much, all the way down to Mississippi. And you're right, we're tired, and it's the kind of tide that says things have to change. Leon Tyler from Pennsylvania Poor People. Brother Leon on.
We've been fighting for 40 years, Reverend, here in Philadelphia with homelessness, battling on houselessness, which is basically because we don't have enough housing to put people in houses, not including the people who are homeless, who are laying on the streets as we speak today in the cold. At this time, we're fighting this pandemic, which is added to that problem right now. And it's affecting all the counties within the Philadelphia area, which is Chester, Delco, Montgomery, Salem, Gloucester, Cumberland, and all those other groups. We're also dealing with returning citizens who are coming home. I myself, who live with HIV and AIDS, have been living with it for 32 years by the grace of God only. And in that process, I would stand up and represent those who live with HIV, who also are fighting this COVID, who are at high risk. We're also representing and standing instead with LGBTQIA members of the ACT UP group I belong to, along with Poor People's Campaign, Pennsylvania Union for the Homeless, and Put People First. So with the situation we're having with the mayor here, we're having right now.
Thank you so much, Brother Leon. We got to run to the next person, but we thank you so much for the powerful testimony, and people are coming from all over Pennsylvania. You're right, it makes no sense. We got 87 million people without health care, all this homeless with in the street. And people talk about Manchin now, but if Manchin and Sinema had voted to raise the minimum wage to 15, 32 million people would have been lifted out of poverty and would have been able to afford more housing. We've got to stop talking about these issues in silos and put them together. Robin, as our last live speaker impacted from the Ohio Poor People. Robin?
Hi, good morning. I come to you today fighting the systemic evils of ecological devastation through lead poisoning, which has disproportionately impacted African Americans where I live at in Cleveland, Ohio. I am a parent advocating for environmental justice and equality for our lead poisoned children. My plight started with my daughter becoming severely lead poisoned at 70 micrograms per deciliter, which is a death, seizure, coma level. And throughout the years, I see we as families dealing with lead poisoning challenges, as well as the systemic racisms in the area of healthcare, education, housing, support services, food parties, transportations, and utilities. We need change. We are the change. That's why I'm here, supporting mass poor people and low wages workers assembly and moral march on Washington. We have to change.
Thank you. We know the Buckeye State is coming in strong for us because it's time. Thank you so much, Robin, for your power and your passion. Now, in the Poor People's Campaign, we have data and empirical data. We don't just holler and scream. We have a reason to holler and scream. We also unpack the lies of scarcity. We challenge the lie that we don't know what to do. We know what can be done. This is done. It can happen. And so we have two economists today representing a whole cohort of economists who are going to be coming around us. And Dr. Jeffrey Sachs specifically is coming on today after Shelley Gupta Barnes' presentation to talk about a new study that he's going to help have economists together to write on the poor and low wealth and what has not happened in this pandemic, what could have happened, and what's here and what needs to happen, and why the economists are glad that finally there's a movement bringing poor and low wealth people together all across this country that is not going to just be a one-day event, but a constant and formidable push for third Reconstruction. Attorney Shelley Gupta Barnes first, and then Dr. Jeffrey Sachs.
So I have 10 points that I wanted to go through quickly, but these lay out the reasoning of why we're going to June and why the study that we're doing together is so important. So first, we are now nearly 2 years into the coronavirus pandemic, yet we still do not know the true public health impacts of COVID on the 140 million poor and low income people in the nation. There has not been any significant and widespread reporting by income or income inequality, including across race, occupation, age, or region. Two, what we do know is that poor and low income households are more vulnerable to the economic impacts of the pandemic and benefit from regular ongoing support. In fact, more than 90% of poor and low income households spent their child tax credit payments for food, housing, water, electricity, and utilities, and clothing, meeting basic needs. However, number three, as of 2022, nearly all of the pandemic era programs that benefit poor and low income people have ended, including unemployment assistance, protections against eviction and foreclosure, and these child tax credit payments. Meanwhile, number four, the nation's wealthiest people have gained over $2 trillion directly, continually, and without nearly any restrictions. In fact, big businesses and large employers have been able to protect their interests to push back against a full Build Back Better agenda, including wage increases, paid leave, immigration justice, and higher taxes on their wealth and capital gains. They've also successfully pushed back on longer quarantine and isolation requirements. And most recently, the Supreme Court ruled against mandated vaccine testing and mask requirements for large employers, but not smaller ones. And still, number six, lawmakers are accommodating the concerns of the wealthy and of corporations in particular their alarm about higher wages and using the excuse of inflation to push back against additional government spending. However, economists are calling out their faulty reasoning, showing that it was not government spending on anti-poverty programs that is causing inflation, but the pandemic, supply chain issues, and even the monopoly power of corporations. They're also saying that fears of inflation are an invalid reason to not invest in people. Number eight, without these pandemic relief programs, in fact, the number of poor and low-income people would have grown to millions more than 140 million. And we can expect that now that these programs have ended, we can expect a backslide into greater poverty. So number nine, as we heard earlier, although poor and low-income people accounted for 1/3 of the voting electorate, what this shows us is that their concerns are still not a political priority. And this is the effect in part of a rolling coup that has been constraining the political will since at least 2010 through voter suppression and other attacks on democracy. In 2021 alone, 19 states passed more than 30 voter suppression laws that will potentially impact 55 million eligible voters. This is why we're organizing towards June, because moral policies that prioritize 140 million, that protect and secure voting rights and a robust democracy are also good and sound economics.
Thank you so much, Attorney Shelley Gupta-Bond. And as we bring Dr. Sachs onto the media, this massive study we're going to do will hopefully released in April, right around the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. But as we enter to the last 2 months push towards this mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington and to the polls. Dr. Sachs.
Reverend Barber, thank you very much. And Shelley, thank you for laying it out so clearly, and to all of the speakers for your passionate voice and your bravery and determination. The Poor People's Campaign is essential for the survival of our nation, which is being pulled apart at the seams by a small group of oligarchic, super rich, and suffering Americans across the spectrum. And what we are seeing right now is that the rich, as Shelley just said, have gotten so unbelievably rich, we can't even fathom. 6 Americans now, 6 people have $950 billion of personal wealth as of this morning. That is Elon Musk, Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, Larry Page, Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, 6 people. You know, that would be enough for 90 million Americans to get $10,000 each. We can't even fathom what's happening in this country, except we were told many years ago by Warren Buffett, one of the people on the list of the super billionaires, He said, there's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich, that's waging war, and we're winning. He said it bemoaningly because he said this is so outrageous what's happening. But he said the rich are waging war on the poor. And so the Poor People's Campaign is in the context of a war that has been waged by the rich. And the amount of wealth that's going to the top is unbelievable. And then who comes along but Manchin and Sinema and others who say, oh, no, don't tax those rich people. And therefore, we can't afford to give money to poor people who are trying to keep their children properly fed. This is really a sickness in this country. And it is pulling us absolutely apart at the seams. And the evidence every day shows this. And who kept this country running during the last 2 years? The people on the front lines, the people in the factories, in the warehouses, the first responders, the people delivering groceries and goods to rich people. And who suffered the infections and the deaths? Of course, hugely disproportionately, it's the poor people in this country.
That's right.
Who have been on the front lines keeping the country going. But they're not seeing. All we hear is all these super rich people saying, I don't want my taxes to be raised. Oh, that would be inflationary. And an absolutely corrupt Congress, dominated by millionaires, paid by billionaires, that will wreck this country entirely until your voices are heard, registered, and empowered. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign is about. And that's, Reverend Barber, why you gave us an assignment and we're on the case to have a pandemic report card by April that tells the truth about what's going on in this country and that lays it out clearly. Who's working hard round the clock, getting infected, dying, so that rich people can say, oh, I'm okay, I'm sheltering fine, someone's delivering everything I need right now. And then these politicians, disgusting, turn around and say, oh, we can't afford this. And they can't afford it because they have cut the taxes for the super rich year after year and say, oh, we have no money left. Sorry, it's all gone into the hands of 6 people who have $1 trillion. So we're going to lay it out clearly.
Amen.
And we're going to make sure that this country is saved. You're going to do it. We're going to give you all the support, and we're going to mobilize every voice of decency we can and every bit of expertise we can find to tell it like it is. Reverend Barber, thank you so much. And especially thanks to all the people that are part of this campaign. It's so vital for this country's very survival.
I love something you said, tell it like it is, because only the truth can set us free. And people need to know we're not begging for the government to do something. We're trying to help save this democracy. We can't
that is exactly right.
like this. We cannot continue like this. And poor nowhere people, the first to have to go to work, first get infected, first get sick, first to die, first to be called essential, and then be treated like expendable. No. We cannot. Thank you, Dr. Sachs, and thank you to the many other economists and others that are coming alongside us to say what we must have is we don't have scarcity. What we do have is a lack of moral consciousness and moral movement, but it's up to us to change that. And now for the members of the media, we're going to have religious leaders and other persons, leaders who lead major organizations, unions of 2 million people, denominations of millions and millions of people who are co-partnering with us. And each one of them are coming. We're asking them to give at least a minute so that we can also take questions from the media of why they are as religious bodies and as activists and other organizations and unions joining in helping make this massive mobilization, the largest we want to see it in the history of the country. Let us start with, we're going to start with Jim Winkler, who represents the National Council of Churches. Then we're going to go to Reverend Dr. Beth Johnson with the Unitarian Universalists. And then we're going to go to Ms. Mary Kay Henry with the Service Employees International Union, and then to Reverend Terry Howard Owens with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And after they give their statement, then I'll come back and give about 4 more, and then we'll be taking questions. Brother Jim Winkler.
As president of the National Council of Churches, I'm here today to say I'm excited about and supportive of the plans for a mass poor people's and low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington and to the polls on June 18th. I will be there, and I will work with the leaders of our 37-member denominations comprised of 100,000 local congregations and 30 million church members to make sure we are there in force. We'll be there because we face a constellation of crises that must be addressed by people of faith. These include a growing gap between people of wealth and those of low wealth, a pandemic that's being ignored at the risk of death by far too many, a militarized nation that must turn to the ways of peace, the intensifying reality of climate change, the death-dealing impact of systemic racism, and the attempts to take away the right to vote from the American people. We're coming together on June 18th because as people of faith, we know the truth Jesus names when he said, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." See you on June 18th.
Thank you so much. And we're going to thank every aspect of the National Council of Churches for joining up as we join together as moral partners in this. Reverend Dr. Beth Johnson.
This morning, representing the Unitarian Universalist Association, as we join the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival in the launch of the mass Poor People's and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington. We are here because now is the time to speak. Now is the time to act. We have to make sure our elected leaders make the moral choices that holding elected office demands. An overwhelming majority of Americans support the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. On the eve of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, the King family is calling for no celebration without legislation. The right to accessible voting is an essential and a sacred one. We can't get justice for our communities unless we get access to the ballot for all and build a multiracial democracy. The relationships that we're building in the Poor People's Campaign, in the collective struggle for justice, are the lasting and accountable threads that ground movements and build thriving communities. Now is the time for collective action and for committing to join us in Washington, D.C. on June 18th, 2022 for a mass Poor People's and Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and beyond to the polls, because nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn around now. Our deadline is victory.
God bless you. Thank you so much, my dear sister. Sister Mary Kay Henry with the service, SEIU.
Have been SEIU members are proud to join together with the entire Poor People's Campaign and mobilize for the mass assembly and moral march on Washington and to the polls on this June 18th, 2022. We are nursing home workers who have been infected and died at higher rates during this entire pandemic, and we've had it, and we want to show up in Washington. We are fast food workers who are working 2 and 3 jobs and can't make ends meet and need corporations and the government to do the right thing. We are janitors and airport workers and hospital workers and public workers who know what it means to unite the power of poor people and low-wage workers, because we can build the nation that our children deserve. And we are not going to waste this once-in-a-generation opportunity to bring forth transformational change. Any economic recovery must include good union living wage jobs for home care workers and all essential workers that we've heard from today. We're proud to join with the Poor People's Campaign in building a movement of millions of working people, low-wage workers, alongside of poor people who are also voters and that are going to change the direction of this country November 22. Thank you for including us. We're proud to stand in solidarity and love with all of you.
Thank you so much. We are religious leaders. We are union leaders. We are impacted. We're coming together. And now to add to the chorus of support, as we've been building over the years, are our Jewish brothers and sisters, Rabbi Jonah Passionate. Excuse me, Jonah. I'm sorry, I'm messing your name up. Jonah Passionate. And then we're going to have our dear sister Latasha Brown with Black Voters Matter. And then we move on. Rahina is going to come and share at this time. Rabbi, thank you so much, and we love you.
Reverend Barbara, I love you too. And you know, we are in a time of great crisis, a moral crisis. Millions of our people face barriers to economic security, quality health care, and devastation from climate change. And it's all exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and deeply rooted structural inequity. And amidst all of this, our democracy itself is under attack. How will we elect leaders that will listen to the voices of low-income workers and prioritize uplifting marginalized communities when state after state after state is rolling back voting rights and innovating new ways to disenfranchise our own people, especially targeting Black, Latinx, and Native American voters? And 1 year after the violent white supremacist insurrection at the nation's capital, we know the profound danger that we confront. But we also know, Reverend Barber, that our safety is in our solidarity, and the redemption of our nation may yet come despite centuries of disenfranchisement through our democracy. That's why the Senate must reform the filibuster and pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act so that our political system represents all Americans. This MLK Day, we must honor his legacy and demand legislation to protect the sacred right to vote, the vote that MLK and other civil rights leaders and many Reform Jewish rabbis fought for and died for. Reform Jews believe the selection of our leaders is not a privilege, but a collective responsibility. Dr. Barber, you know that Isaiah taught we are to do good, pursue justice, and in so doing, relieve oppression. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Pestner. And I'm glad you brought that up, because Dr. King said at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March something we have to connect in America. He said it was the fear of the exercise of the ballot by the masses of white people and Black people joining together around an agenda that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture of the nation. That was the reason why voter suppression happened. That fear of what he called the Southern aristocracy. Because we know that ultimately at the end of the day, suppression of voting rights is about being able to determine the policies of the nation and to control the purse strings of the nation, which equate to $21 trillion gross domestic product in every year, and to keep that from those who need it the most. Thank you so much. Sister Latasha Brown.
Thank you, Reverend Barber, for having me. I just want to say that, part of this, the reason why Black Voters Matter is joining this moral movement, that we want to spread the good news. I am a activist, but I'm also a woman of faith. And in this moment right here, what we recognize is not this country that we need this country needs us. Instead of us seeing ourselves just as citizens of a broken country, and what we want to do is spread the news that we are building a new country. There's a new coalition of people that are rising up in this nation, that we're driven not by money or driven by power, but we're driven by our deep sense of love for humanity. And that when we're talking about, if we're going to celebrate Dr. King's legacy, he talked about the three evils. He talked about poverty and war and poverty and war and racism as those three evils. And so this is an intersection of that. We're going to take this opportunity to reframe a new narrative that we're moving forward. We're going to create the kind of America that we desire and that we deserve. The good news is that we're here. We ain't going nowhere. This will not be a transaction. This will be transformative. We will literally create the kind of world that literally is going to be the beloved community of which he spoke of.
Natasha, thank you for reminding us people of that, because on that day and in between, on June 18th, we will be unveiling the third Reconstruction agenda. That's actually already, some of us in Congress, but even the more, just saying there's a way out. We've got the answers. This doesn't have to be. So thank you for reminding that. We will curse the darkness, but God knows we bring in a light. God knows we bring in a light and a new direction. Rahina?
Yes, thank you, Reverend Barber. Hello, everyone. On behalf of our millions of members, it is an honor to be here today. The Move On community is millions strong. We are a diverse, vibrant community of folks, activists all over this country in every state, every congressional district. And we together eagerly join the Poor People's Campaign in this moment that we are all in. We are all in. We are all in to fight against the inequality in this nation that the raging pandemic has only made worse. We are all in to fight the systemic racism and classism in this country and the dark forces that have been unleashed in recent years that are attacking our democracy and the right to vote. We are all in to fight the poverty in this country, which has a stranglehold over too many of our people and is a cancer in our society. We are all in to fight for healthcare for all and ensure that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, in the wealthiest country on the planet.
That's right.
And we are all in to fight the big corporations and CEOs who are making record profits as we speak and huge bonuses, while too many of us continue to struggle to make ends meet. Our country has the resources, the people are ready, and the need has never been greater. The time for politics as usual is over. The time for political games is over. The time for empty rhetoric has passed. The need for action and transformational change is now. The moment demands nothing less. So Move On members are with you. They're here. We will organize, we will mobilize, and we will march. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for having me.
God bless you. And I know Liz Theo Harris joins me in saying, you're right, 87 million people without health care in this country. When people get elected and get free health care just because they got elected and then don't want the people that elected them to have the same thing, oh no, we cannot and will not accept that. We must shift this moral narrative and build power and change this nation. We also have been working with our First Nation brothers and sisters from day one. And on that stage in June and beyond, the voices you will hear will be impacted people, not people speaking for them. The majority of those voices will be people impacted. And Dr. Nosey is with us with the Apache Stronghold, but representing so many other people as well. I want our Native brothers and sisters. Dr. Nosey, would you say to us why in this moment the Native First Nation community has said, you know, we need to be a part of this massive assembly, not just for a day, but for a declaration.
Thank you for the opportunity. What's really important that we need to understand is that Mother Earth is being destroyed. And from holy places to the value of water and the environment. And one of the things that's so important for us to be involved is to work together so that we can have a clear understanding of building a better world for everyone, because we're all being affected by it. And one of the things that worry us about Native Americans, being Native Americans, is the fact that these that were created by God have a spirit. And we have to be able to balance that to have a sustainable life. And if we destroy water like corporations and what Congress is doing, then all these things that we talk about doesn't matter, because we're going to be destroyed. Life is going to be destroyed. because those things are really valuable. And for Indian people, prior to people coming to this country, what they said was that there's a lie, a great lie, and they're talking about a deception, that one day the children will cry. So as Indian people, we have to wait for that day so that we could be unified to fight what is evil that has come here to what is America today. And that's why for me, myself, and so many Native people, we're joining the Free People's Campaign, because it's a spiritual road to the fight the most evil thing that has come here, so that corporations will be controlled by us so that we can have a sustainable life for all the children yet to be born and all God's creation. So that's what brings me to be involved with the Free People's Campaign. But thank you.
I thank you for reminding us too of the power of prophetic crying. You know, in one of my scriptures, Isaiah said, there comes a time you have to cry loud and spare not. That's the only way for transformation. You can't play games. You can't be in the back room right out front where the whole world can see it. You have to cry loud and spare not. And then God says, if I hear a remnant crying, I will assist them in the change until justice flows down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you so much. Now, people know we don't normally have elected politicians to speak at our events per se, but we have had two persons that are on the front lines of fighting against policies that create poverty and low wealth. And we asked them to come on this not to talk about Democrat and Republican today, but to say from their position why a moral movement, not just a day, not just doing something, but a moral movement, and for poor and low wealth people and their allies to speak up, why from inside they see it as more important than ever before in this nation that we shift the moral conscience, because they're in the midst of the Congress every day. So at this time, we want to have each one of them will come for about a minute or so and share that. And that is none other than Representative Barbara Lee and Senator Elizabeth Warren. And then we will close out with Caitlin Swain and Reverend Jackson and take questions from the media.
Thank you. Bishop Barber, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I can't be on video. I'm en route to a meeting, but I want to just first thank you, Bishop Barber. Thank the Poor People's Campaign, and thank all of those impacted individuals who really have spoken out and continue to speak out to remind the country that what is taking place now in the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world as it relates to poverty and low wealth people, low wealth communities, the shame and disgrace in the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world is a moral issue. And this is a clarion call. It's a clarion call to step up and to make sure and make certain that the policies in this country address the fact that we're a country supposedly of liberty and justice for all. And that means the right to vote. That means we have to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. That means we must pass the Freedom to Vote Act. That means we must pass Build Back Better and make sure that the child tax credit does not go away, as it will, because that has not been renewed. And it also means, Bishop Barber, that we must pass our resolution calling for a third Reconstruction, H.R. 438, which is a framework to address the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, poverty, and ecological devastation, and denounces the denial of healthcare, militarism, and vilification of the poor. And so we need to prioritize the needs and demands of the 140 million people suffering each from poverty and truly build from the bottom up, from housing to healthcare to public assistance and support to water and education, all of the rights that Americans deserve, because this is a country, once again, of liberty and justice for all. It's un-American not to do this. And so thank you all again. Thank all of you for mobilizing and organizing. The only way that Congress is going to move is because of the people, for the people. This is power to the people where I come from in Oakland, California. We understand that power, and that power has got to be heard in the halls of Congress. We're going to win this because it's a moral issue.
Thank you so much. We gotta.
Thank you. Thank you again.
And I made one mistake, and y'all got to let me correct it, because I did not let my bishop, my general minister, she was on the line, and I don't know if it's COVID tied or what, but I am not going to miss this in the water. I'm sorry. But Reverend Terry Howard Orn, who leads the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, major denomination in this country. Would you share with us, and then Senator Warren?
Thank you, Bishop, and I'll be quick here. Disciples of Christ across the country are participating in and actually leading in all of the state campaigns. And so on June 18th of 2022, we will join with others to continue the work to bring about a society where all have enough to flourish, because there is enough in this country. This movement is not about an event, a rally, or even as a march. This is, as we would say as disciples, a movement for wholeness. And it is about changing the moral narrative of this country so that we're committed to action that will eradicate poverty, racism, voter suppression, and any other injustice that diminishes our humanity. From the ground up, every voice must be heard. As people of Christian faith, we say that we are committed to love, which demands action to bring about a nation where all can flourish as the teachings of Jesus command us. But it's not enough to just say these things. It is time for people of Christian faith to be the church that we say we are. The voices and faces of those who are impacted must be heard. And so we must stand together to insist that those who are elected to represent us are held accountable when their cowardice and inaction ignore the human suffering and inequity all around them. As part of this movement for wholeness, this movement for action, Disciples of Christ will be there until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Thank you so much, Reverend Owens. Thank you so much. Senator Warren.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here and to join you, Reverend Barber, and everyone who is on this call. Now, I've been thinking lately about what the Reverend Dr. King warned America when he said that we were at a crossroads of history and called for a mass mobilization of America's poor and disenfranchised and marginalized. He had this vision to bring thousands of citizens together in Washington, D.C. to demand that the United States government confront and address the evil of poverty. And now here we are. More than 50 years later, it's 2022. America is once again at a crossroads. Wages have barely budged in years. Affordable housing is almost impossible to find. Families are unable to afford quality care for their children, for their sick and aging relatives. People are unable to afford their medications and their health care. Workers are fighting for safe working conditions, and many people have no paid leave to be able to stay home if they get sick or someone in their family is sick. The pandemic has multiplied these challenges. It has exposed deep systemic inequalities for millions of Americans. Billionaires have gotten richer during this time. Corporate profits have skyrocketed, and many American families have been crippled economically. But throughout this crisis, we have a one-in-a-generation opportunity to pass critical legislation that supports working families. We have a chance to rebuild our economy so that it works for everyone. We have a chance to address this moral crisis that has trapped Americans in a cycle of poverty. The American Rescue Plan that we passed last spring took important steps to support families. It did. But there is so much more that needs to be done. We need to pass Build Back Better, make historic investments to transform our economy and to improve people's lives. Build Back Better is about reducing the cost of childcare. It's about reducing the cost of prescription drugs, insulin in particular. It's about reducing the cost of healthcare overall. It's about fighting the climate crisis. It's about all the things we urgently need. And for the first time, we're talking about enough support to make childcare accessible for every family. Look, the pieces are all there. This is our moment. It is truly a crisis, a moral crisis.
And we in Congress need to step up. We in the Senate need to step up. We do that with your support. So thank you again for having me here today. I am committed to the cause. I will be with you every step of the way.
Thank you so much, Senator Warren. And thank you for always saying that we may do something, it's a step, but we got to keep stepping. And that's what we're saying. We support Build Back Better, but we know that's a step. It's not the end of the journey. And we've got to continue to push. None of this has to be, and we can be changed. We're going to ask Caitlin Swain as she comes as a voting rights attorney for 1 minute, and then the Reverend Dr. Alvin Jackson, who is the executive director of the team that's going to be organizing and mobilizing this mass Poor People's Low Wage Workers Assembly, Moral March on Washington and to the polls, will conclude us, and then we'll take questions from the media.
Good morning. As co-director of Forward Justice, we are eyewitnesses to the moral crisis in the South and nationally, a rolling coup attempt, an avalanche of voter suppression and election subversion laws to target, suppress, and strangle the voice of the American people and the promise of multiracial democracy. We come together on June 18th because, like the first Poor People's Campaign led by Dr. King, this campaign is not deterred by or beholden to daily up or down signals and timelines announced from Washington, D.C. Its compass is with the dreams of this country's more than 140 million multiracial, multi-faith, poor and low-wealth peoples rising up united and unafraid, using our power to break the grip of poverty, war, and systemic racism, expand the we and we the people, and birth a country that works for all of us. We know our deadline is victory. We will save and expand this living democracy, and our North Star will be a third reconstruction of America. We know that this is for our children, and we will not stop until we win.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jackson.
All right, Dr. Barbara, Dr. Liz, panelists, this great energy here, powerful statements and powerful support. Nothing will be more tragic than for us to turn around now. And so we move forward to June 18, 2022 and beyond, not a day, but a declaration of an ongoing movement to build power and to pass policies that make a difference for the poor from the bottom up. Glad that you're all here today, and we thank you for joining us. And I think we're ready for questions, Bishop Barber. I think there's a question from Dion from the Wall Street Times. His question is, what is the plan moving forward if Democrats fail to remove the filibuster?
Well, Dion, first of all, our plan is one of the things we're doing now. Number one, we believe we should have never had a separation of infrastructure bill, Build Back Better, and voting rights. We should have had recognized that the infrastructure of democracy, the infrastructure of our daily lives and the economy, and the infrastructure of roads and bridges have to go together. When you hear us saying we're mobilizing this mass Poor People's Low Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington to the polls, part of our third reconstruction agenda is calling for the transformation of the filibuster. But part of what we have not had is put a face on this. We talk about the filibuster. We talk about it as how it hurts Black people. The filibuster has hurt everybody in this country, Black folk, women, the labor movement. We've also keep talking about Indian filibuster, but we've never even called it out what this is. It's not a filibuster. This is a coward filibuster. It's not even a real filibuster. The real filibuster, you had to defend it on the floor. So what we got to do is shift the moral narrative because we've been talking about it wrong. And then we talk about ending the filibuster, but we've not talked about what holding on to the filibuster is doing. See, you get locked in that argument, or an argument about 3 trillion or 2 trillion, or argument about Joe Manchin versus Biden. No, it's those who hold on to the filibuster And when they do, they stand against 32 million Americans who make less than a living wage. When they do, they stand against 87 million people who don't have health care. When they do, they stand against 17 million people that would benefit from earned income tax credit. When they do, they stand against 31 million people that would benefit from child income tax credit. When they do, they are standing against 56 million Americans, not black folk, 56 million Americans whose votes will be suppressed by them losing the possibility, the very processes the vote they used in 2020 will be undermined by what's happening in these states' legislatures and through gerrymandering. We must put a face on these issues. And that's part of what this movement is doing. And stop talking about it as though it's just numbers and policy. But when you stand for things like the filibuster, you are literally standing for the undermining the demise of the nation people, the nation's people. Actually, lastly, you know, the word filibuster actually comes from a word that was used in Latin America, and it means to pirate. It means to steal. It's literally what it means. It was a group of people that would go in and destabilize Latin communities so that greedy folk could steal from them. Filibusterers is what my brother Mark Thompson talks about. We got to talk in a different term, and we've not done that. And that's why this movement, and it can't be just a politician. It can't just be people speaking on that. It needs to be poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, and color impacted, so that if you say you stand for the filibuster, McConnell and others, and Manchin and whoever, then you're standing against the millions of people in your state who are poor and low wealth. That is the transformational narrative shift that has to happen. And remember, this is not a day. Please, media, understand. This is a declaration. It's not a moment, it's a movement. And we intend to stay all the way to then and then to the polls and even beyond, using every tool, even massive nonviolent civil disobedience, because our deadline is victory.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. We're open for additional questions from the media. You can put your questions in the chat, and would remind all of us to go to poorpeoplescampaign.org to sign up for June 18, 2022 for the Mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly and Moral March on Washington and to the polls. So if there are additional questions, you may put them in the chat as well. Can the economists address the fact that in just 3 months, September, October, November, 13.1 million Americans have left their jobs? That's 500,000 more than are in the AFL-CIO. Low-wage jobs are the most impacted with this great resignation. Isn't time to uplift workers through things like childcare to actually grow the economy? That is from Robert Henley. I'm not sure who Robert is with. Robert, will ask you to identify yourself, but that is a question to the economist from Robert Henley.
Dr. Sachs, are you still on with us? Or Dr. Gupta Barnes?
Robert is from the salon.
Are they keying up? Good. There you go, Doc. All right.
Yes, there has been this dramatic great resignation in light of the working conditions, low wages, and other challenges and failures of employers and the government to protect workers in this time. It is not only is it the time to uplift workers through things like childcare but also with things like living wages. It should not be just on the states to raise minimum wages as much as they would decide, but rather we need a federal mandate on what the minimum wage ought to be. It hasn't grown. It hasn't been raised past $7.25 since 2009. And we are facing, we have come through an economic crisis that was far deeper than the Great Recession in 2008, even if its recovery has been different. And so it is both the time to pass policies that uplift workers, and support their families, as well as acknowledge the work itself that people are doing that, as others have said, lift up this economy and make this country run.
Yeah. And Charlotte, people should know that every state that is a voter suppression state is also a state from which the politicians block living wages. These are the connections we're going to be making. These are the connections we're going to be putting in front of them because they're often separated out. And when we talk about investment in the people, with one no vote, for instance, Manchin, Sinema, and the whole cohort of Republicans in the bill for recovery said no to 32 million Americans who would have had their wages raised to a living wage. That would have pumped over $300 billion directly into the economy. And 41% of African Americans alone would have been lifted out of poverty and low wealth. So that vote that they did to block living wages is just as racist and class-based as a vote against not to do voting rights. We must connect these issues and recognize it's not one or two tweaks here that we need to do, but fundamental policy shift, which is why in April at the report, we're also going to lay out and we've already done it last year, but we're going to do it again, the third Reconstruction policy agenda of this movement, because we're not just saying what's wrong. We actually have a policy agenda that will point us and turn this country in a new direction and in the right direction.
This is another question from the Reuters news service. Andrea Shalal, I believe is the last name, but you mentioned massive nonviolent civil disobedience. What form could that take? Are you preparing plans to trigger that? Could such actions occur before the march?
Well, we're not going to say everything we're going to do, but we've already triggered it. In June, we launched Moral Mondays in Washington, D.C. In June, we had one of the largest gatherings of people that got arrested challenging the Congress in June. And we are putting all of that on the table in terms of where we are headed. We will be talking about that in the days to come. We're getting ready to engage in a tour across the country. Right now, we're engaging in a form of nonviolent direct action by having call-ins going since New Year's. We've had over 1,000 people calling every day to Manchin and Sinema since we can't do a sit-in. Manchin, Sinema, McConnell, and Schumer because of coronavirus. So we're being smart looking at coronavirus. Massive gathering is a form of nonviolent direct action. Going to the polls is a form of nonviolent direct action. But what we're trying to say is we are preparing and ready. People are ready. We're not violent. We're not the insurrection. We're the resurrection. And we don't have to use the tools of ugliness and mean and hurt and hell and fighting and stuff. We are willing to put our bodies on the line. Poor and low wealth people are saying, see me. I'm going to make you see me. You're not going to ignore me anymore. You're not going to just wrap me up in numbers. You're not going to just talk about the middle class and not talk about the poor, because this trickle down economics and neo liberalism has hurt us. And Liz, I want Liz to come on and say a word to Reuters about that, because she's been in this movement and she said right in her remarks, it is time for a brigade of ambulance drivers to sound the alarm. Liz, would you talk to them, answer that question as well from Reuters?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bishop Barber, and for the question, because times like this demand people to put themselves out there, engage in nonviolent civil disobedience and moral direct action. We know that this is what has the power to actually make the power structures of our nation say yes, when they really, at this point, have been saying no to us. And so, folks are already engaging in regular action, as Bishop Barber was talking about, both our season and seasons of Moral Mondays and Moral Direct Action, where hundreds of people have been putting themselves out there, engaging in direct action, willing to risk arrest, to make sure that we can arrest the attention of the nation. We have folks doing housing eviction resistance. We have folks, out there kind of in general strikes and in other forms of strikes of low-wage workers, and the kind of activity that is going to be necessary to be able to really get the country to pay attention to the problems that people are facing, but the solutions that are at hand that those with power and wealth are refusing to actually make into policy. It's going to take that kind of action, and we, in our 45 state coordinating committees all across the country with the partner organizations that we're connected to that represent millions of people, are going to keep on pushing, and we will push towards June and from June to make sure that people's voices are heard.
And to the question lastly, there's never been a time in history, whether the first Reconstruction of the 19th century, second Reconstruction, civil rights movement, we're saying now there's a need for third Reconstruction. There's never been a time in history where you've had the fundamental transformational change necessary without having agitation, litigation, legislation, voter participation, and public information. All of those things and declarations, it has to all be together, because we're not begging the government. We're trying to save the nation. This nation cannot continue with 43% of its people living in poverty and low wealth in the richest nation in the world. And while that is happening, we see all of this obstructionism and attempt to block voting rights and attempt to block living wages. And think about the moral crisis we're in the middle of a pandemic. Politicians don't even have the heart to make sure everybody has health care, to make sure everybody can get a free test. We are in a place of moral crisis. This is, as the Declaration of Independence says, we are facing a long train of abuses. And the Declaration of Independence says when a people have faced a long train of abuse, it is their duty to throw off that form of government and to create something new in its place and transform it in place. We are saying to America, save yourself. You cannot be true to the principles of establishing justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, and ensuring domestic tranquility and equal protection under the law, and refuse to address the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and this false moral narrative of religious nationalism and white supremacy that is holding our public policy hostage.
I see only one last question here, only one question in the queue here, Bishop Barber panel. This is from KPFA News. Would you support a primary challenge to Senator Sinema by Congressman Gallio?
What we are supporting is a primary and principled raising up of the 30 poor and low wealth electorate that has not been unleashed or spoken to or talked to. Our job is to move that 30% of poor and low wealth people and 45% in battleground states. Our data tells us that at a minimum of 15 states, if just between 1 and 22% of poor and low, 25% of poor and low wealth people who are already eligible to vote, already registered, who stopped voting because they never hear anybody talking about them, talking about their conditions, laying out a plan. Well, if they decide to vote for their own agenda and not wait on the politicians, but to engage to transform the political system, then in those states, poor and low wealth people can determine who sits in the governor's office, who determine who sits in the Congress, who determine who sits in the Senate and in the president's office. In Georgia, I think it's 7% of poor and low wealth people that could turn things, 4% in Florida, 1% in Michigan, 19% in North Carolina. That's where our primary focus is rallying that sleeping giant. Or may I say, maybe that beaten down group of people who for years have not heard anything but trickle down and neoliberalism. But now they are deciding we're rising up. We are rising up, and and God has fixed it so that now in this, the 21st century, the stones that the builders rejected represent 30% of the electorate in this country and 45% in most of the battleground states. And we will not be silent or on the sidelines anymore.
poorpeoplescampaign.org. Sign up June 2022, June 18, 2022, poorpeoplescampaign.org.
We close out with the promo one more time, and then we'll be through for today. Thank you to everybody. Love you so much.
We welcome you to the launch of the Mass Poor People's Low Wage Assembly and Moral March on Washington, D.C., June 18, 2022. We are a new, unsettling force, and we are powerful. New, unsettling force, and we are here.
We're rising up to demonstrate the compelling power that we, poor and low-income people, have to reconstruct society from the bottom up.
And we need to do it with the loudest voices possible, the biggest actions possible.
Because we know that there is no scarcity in this land. The only scarcity is the moral will to do what's right.
Hold on, just a little while longer.
We are those with sub-minimum wage jobs who can't afford sky-high rent.
People with disabilities are the fastest growing minority group.
It's crazy to me that in 2021, it's still legal for workplaces to pay a sub-minimum wage to people with disabilities.
There are still so much trial and tribulations that we go through as Indigenous people. We can't get a decent wage to sustain ourselves, nor can we get adequate housing.
Veterans across this nation say enough is enough. We can't pat essential workers on the back on one day and then cut their health care the next day.
Health is a political choice.
What more do I need to do to prove that my voice is just as valuable as anyone else's?
There are still forces in denial that would try to slow walk our transition to a clean economy and a just future for us all.
We have an immoral system run by immoral people.
But together we walk, and we walk and we fight.
It's time for a change. Reconstruyamos esta gran nación.
See, we are people of resilience. As we fight these interlocking injustices together,
when we work together, mobilize together, and rise together, we become a voice for the voiceless, and we become an agent of change in a time where great change is needed.
We need the third reconstruction to ensure that deaf people, people with disabilities, and all people can have the right to live and to thrive.
We know what they are doing, but the question is, what are we going to do? Reconstruction begins when we change our mentality and say it's time for you to get your foot off of my neck.